If in the middle of July you are still feeding your tomatoes and cucumbers the same way you did in spring, you are probably already losing a part of your harvest without realizing it. The worst part is that the plants still look green and strong. That is why many people think everything is going well. But then come tomatoes that are large on the outside and watery on the inside, cucumbers with little flavor or even bitter ones, flowers that fall off without forming fruit, and plants full of leaves that barely produce. I made that mistake myself for many years and thought the problem was the weather, the seeds, or bad luck. Until an older farmer told me something I never forgot. He told me that a plant in July no longer thinks like a plant in May, and that if you don't change the way you care for it, the plant itself stops investing its energy where we really want it to. That day I understood why some neighbors harvested entire boxes of sweet tomatoes, while others just looked at huge bushes with little yield. The difference wasn't in spending more money or buying expensive fertilizers. The difference was in understanding what the plant really needs when summer's already well underway. Most people keep adding a lot of nitrogen because they want green leaves and rapid growth. But in July, that usually becomes a mistake that costs pounds of harvest. The plant uses that energy to make more branches and more foliage when it should be focusing on filling out the fruits, making them bigger, sweeter, and ensuring it keeps producing for many weeks. That change seems small, but it completely transforms the results of the garden. Today, I want to show you exactly how I make this change every summer, using very cheap products that almost anyone has within reach. You won't need complicated preparations or expensive formulas. You will understand why wood ash can become the best food for your tomatoes and cucumbers at this time of year. Why does boric acid help prevent flowers from falling off when the intense heat arrives? And why yeast? Although many consider it a miracle fertilizer, it actually serves a very different function that almost no one explains well. When you understand how these three elements work together, you will stop feeding your plants out of habit and start doing it at the right time. And that is when the garden starts to give back all the effort you have put in since spring. When I understood that in July the plant completely changes its priorities, I stopped looking only at the leaves and started observing the fruits. There I discovered something that many overlook. A tomato plant can be huge, full of branches, and have an intense green color, but that doesn't mean it will yield a great harvest. In fact, the exact opposite often happens. The more nitrogen it receives at this stage, the more energy it dedicates to continuing to grow, and the fewer resources it sends to the tomatoes that are already forming. The same thing happens with cucumbers. The plant looks strong, keeps putting out new leaves, and you think everything is going well. But production starts to become irregular, and the fruits no longer have the same flavor as at the beginning of summer. Many years ago, I also fell into that trap. If I saw a green plant, I thought it was perfectly fed. Then the time came to pick the tomatoes, and I found large but not very sweet fruits, or cucumbers that lost that firm texture we all look for. Then I understood that plants don't always show us the problem where we are looking. In July, the real work is no longer in making leaves. Now everything depends on properly feeding the fruits. This is where two elements come into play that are worth much more than continuing to add nitrogen-rich fertilizers. The first is potassium, and the second is boron. Potassium helps sugars travel to the fruits. Thanks to it, tomatoes develop better color, larger size, firmer flesh, and a much more intense flavor. Something similar happens in cucumbers. When potassium is not lacking, they usually grow straighter, with better texture, and with less tendency to develop that bitterness that so often appears during the hottest days. Boron, on the other hand, works in a different way. Many people don't even think about it and then wonder why the flowers fall off before forming fruit. In reality, the plant needs small amounts of boron precisely when it is flowering and starting to produce new crops. Without it, a good part of the plant's effort ends up being lost prematurely. The funny thing is that none of these products cost much money, and some have been used in traditional gardens for decades. I was taught these methods many years ago, and since then I have never cared for my tomatoes and cucumbers the same way during the summer. But there is one ingredient that always takes first place, and that, for me, makes the difference between a normal harvest and one that surprises even the neighbors. I am referring to wood ash, and there are several mistakes when using it that can ruin the whole result if no one explains them to you beforehand. Wood ash is probably the cheapest resource, and at the same time one of the most valuable you can have in the garden during the month of July. For many years I saw it as just fireplace waste, until an older farmer explained to me that I was throwing away one of the best allies for getting sweeter tomatoes and better quality cucumbers. Since then, I never waste it again. The first thing you should know is that not just any ash will do. It has to come from natural wood without paints, varnishes, or remnants of treated materials. That ash contains a good amount of potassium, precisely the element that plants need right now, much more than nitrogen. When potassium reaches the roots in the right amount, the plants start sending more sugars to the fruits. Tomatoes acquire a more intense color, firm flesh, and a much more pleasant flavor. You even notice that they keep their texture better after picking them. Something similar happens with cucumbers. The fruits grow more uniform, with fewer deformities, and the risk of that bitter taste that so often ruins the harvest during the hottest weeks decreases. What few people do is prepare a good ash extract. The simplest way is to mix a glass of sifted ash into about 10 ml of water, stir well, and let it sit for 24 hours. Afterward, you just have to stir it slightly again and apply about 1 liter of this preparation to the base of each adult plant. If the plant is small, half a liter is enough. There is also a more concentrated version that some use when production is already underway. In that case, 2 glasses of ash are used per 10 ml of water and left to sit for the same amount of time, but I prefer to use it with more time between applications to avoid excess. Normally, one application every 10 or 15 days is enough to maintain a good level of potassium throughout the fruiting stage. There is another detail you should never forget. The soil must be moist before applying the ash. I always water first and only then add the preparation. If you apply it to completely dry soil, you can cause unnecessary stress to the roots and the plant will not properly utilize the nutrients. It is also not advisable to mix ash with nitrogen-rich fertilizers because both work differently and can reduce their effectiveness when used at the same time. Many people try to prepare a mixture with everything together to save time, and that is exactly where one of the most common summer mistakes begins. And there is still one ingredient missing that can prevent flowers from being lost when the heat is on, and that also helps prevent a very well-known problem in tomatoes. After learning to use ash correctly, I discovered that there was still a problem that kept appearing some summers. The plants flowered a lot, but a portion of the flowers ended up falling off before forming fruits. Other times, tomatoes appeared with a black, sunken bottom, just when it seemed like everything was going perfectly. For a long time, I thought it was the heat's fault, but a neighbor who had been growing for over 50 years taught me that often the real culprit was a lack of boron. It is an element that the plant needs in very small amounts, but precisely because of that, many people forget about it. Without enough boron, flowers have a harder time forming good fruits, especially when those July days arrive when temperatures rise significantly. In addition, boron helps calcium move better inside the plant. That detail is very important because poor calcium distribution favors the appearance of blossom end rot. That problem that ruins so many tomatoes when they already seemed almost ready for harvest. The good thing is that you don't have to spend a lot of money to prevent it. Boric acid is cheap and a small amount lasts a long time because the doses must always be very low. I prepare the solution by first dissolving 1 gram of boric acid in a little hot water. When it is completely dissolved, I add it to 10 ml of water and mix well. Then I lightly spray the leaves and flowers, making sure they are moistened but not dripping. I do this early in the morning or late in the afternoon when the sun is no longer beating down hard. I never spray during the hottest hours because the leaves can suffer and the treatment loses effectiveness. It is also not advisable to do it if immediate rain is expected, since the water would wash away a good part of the product before the plant could use it. Normally, it is enough to repeat the application every 2 or 3 weeks while intense flowering continues. Here appears another quite common mistake. Some people think that if a small amount works, a larger dose will work even better. With boron, the exact opposite happens. An excess can be harmful and cause burns on the edges of the leaves, deformities in young shoots, and a decrease in growth. That is why I always respect the amounts and never improvise. In gardening, patience usually yields better results than excess enthusiasm. When you correctly combine ash and boric acid, you have already taken a huge step toward an abundant harvest. But we still need to talk about a product that many consider a miracle fertilizer and that actually serves a completely different function than what most imagine. Now, I want to talk to you about yeast because many tips circulate about it that create false expectations. For years, I heard it said that it was a miracle fertilizer capable of making any plant grow and increasing production on its own. I believed it too until I started calmly observing what was really happening in the soil. Yeast does not directly feed tomatoes or cucumbers the way a fertilizer does. Its real job is much more interesting. It activates the beneficial microorganisms that live in the soil and helps the roots make better use of the nutrients that are already present. In other words, if the soil is well cared for, yeast can give a boost to all that invisible life that works every day for our plants. But if the soil is poor and depleted, yeast alone will not work miracles. That is the mistake most people make. They expect spectacular results after a single application and then say the method doesn't work. I was taught a very simple recipe that I still use when conditions are favorable. I dissolve about 10 gy of dry yeast, or around 100 gram of fresh yeast, along with 2 tablespoons of sugar and 10 L of warm water. I let the mixture sit for about 2 hours and then dilute it again before applying it around the plants. With approximately 1 liter per adult plant, it is usually enough. No more is needed. It is also important that the soil has a pleasant temperature. If the soil is still cold, the microorganisms work much more slowly and the effect decreases significantly. Therefore, July is usually a suitable time to use this preparation as long as the plant is healthy and growing normally. It is also not advisable to repeat the treatment continuously. One application every 3 or 4 weeks is usually more than enough. There is another detail that almost no one explains, and that for me is essential. When microorganisms increase their activity, they consume part of the potassium and calcium available in the soil. That is exactly why I always accompany the use of yeast with wood ash. Never on the same day, but leaving a few days in between. That way I compensate for that consumption and maintain the balance that tomatoes and cucumbers need to continue producing without losing quality. Little by little, I began to understand that none of these products work in isolation. Each one serves a different function, and the true results appear when they are used at the right time. That is exactly the difference between making random applications and following a system that supports the plant from flowering until the final harvest of the summer. When you start seeing these 3 products as part of the same system rather than as isolated remedies, the garden changes completely. I no longer apply them just because a specific day on the calendar says so. First, I observe the plant, and then I decide what it needs at that moment. If the tomatoes and cucumbers are full of new flowers, my priority is to help those flowers turn into fruit. That is where boric acid makes the most sense, always applied carefully and respecting the dosages. I don't need to repeat it constantly because the goal isn't to saturate the plant, but to give it that little boost right when it needs it most. A few weeks later, when the first fruits start to grow and fill out, all my attention shifts to potassium. This is the moment when wood ash truly proves its value. Each application helps the plant focus its energy on the tomatoes and cucumbers instead of endlessly producing leaves. As the summer progresses, I maintain that rhythm, usually every 10 to 15 days, always after a good watering and observing how the plants respond. If I see healthy growth, good leaf color, and fruits developing strongly, I don't change a thing. Often, the best work of a gardener consists precisely of not doing unnecessary things. Yeast only comes into play when I want to stimulate soil activity and I know the temperature allows microorganisms to work intensely. I never use it as a substitute for good fertilizer, and I always follow it up later with an application of ash to maintain the balance of potassium and calcium. Cucumbers deserve special attention because they consume a lot of water and potassium throughout the season. If watering is irregular, the fruits begin to deform, lose quality, and the plant rapidly reduces production. That is why I try to maintain constant moisture without waterlogging the soil. Soil that constantly goes from very dry to very wet stresses the roots and diminishes all the plant's efforts. Tomatoes also appreciate this regularity because it prevents many problems while the fruits are filling out. In the end, everything turns out to be much simpler than it seems. First, you help preserve the flowers, then you properly feed the fruits, and when necessary, you stimulate soil life so the roots keep working vigorously. This sequence has been used for many years in family gardens and continues to work because it respects the natural rhythm of the plants. However, there are still several very common mistakes that can ruin all this work, even if you have used the right products. And it is precisely these mistakes that cause the most lost harvests every summer. If you have made it this far, you will have already understood that a good July harvest does not depend on buying the most expensive fertilizer, but on avoiding the mistakes that most people keep repeating every summer. The first is continuing to apply a lot of nitrogen when the plant should already be focused on producing fruit. At first, it seems to work because more leaves and branches appear, but in the end, you discover that you have fed the part you were least interested in. The second mistake is applying any fertilizer to completely dry soil. The roots suffer unnecessary stress, and a large portion of the nutrients ends up being wasted. I always water first and only then apply any fertilizer. The third mistake consists of mixing all the products in the same container, thinking it saves time. Each one has its function and its moment. Ash works best on its own. Boric acid needs to be applied carefully to the above-ground parts, and yeast should only be used when the soil can truly benefit from its effect. Another very frequent mistake occurs with boric acid. Some people spray it right at noon, just when the sun is strongest. Others double the dose, believing they will get more fruit that way. Neither of these two things helps the plant. On the contrary, they can cause completely unnecessary damage. I also know many amateurs who expect spectacular results after a single application. The garden doesn't work like that. Plants respond to constant care, observation, and the repetition of small actions performed at the right time. That has always been the true secret of the most experienced farmers. They don't look for miracle solutions. They build a simple routine that supports the plant throughout the season, and that is precisely why they get large, sweet, and firm tomatoes until the end of summer, while cucumbers keep appearing week after week with good size, good texture, and without that bitterness that causes so many problems when the intense heat arrives. If you look at your plants with fresh eyes today, you will surely discover what they really need right now. Try these simple recipes, respect the amounts, and maintain the order of each treatment. You will see that often the best results come from old methods that had almost been forgotten and that continue to work because they respect the natural way plants grow. If these tips have transformed your view on caring for your garden this summer, don't forget to subscribe and like the channel. We are rescuing the wisdom of the earth that many tried to bury. Cultivate the future with us. The next treasure of knowledge will be opened very soon.